welcome to this latest incarnation episode of SEPAD Discusses. I'm absolutely delighted to be here again with some wonderful people, some wonderful scholars, friends, and here discussing an absolutely fantastic book with a good number of you in the audience. So thank you all so much for coming along and listening. I'm extremely excited to say that we're here today to discuss May Darwich's wonderful book, Threats and Alliances in the Middle East, Saudi and Syrian Policies in a Turbulent Region. Thank you very much, Greg. But I'm also incredibly excited to say that we have two other wonderful people here alongside May today. So I'll start with May. Many of you know May Darwich, of course, but May is lecturer in international relations at the Middle East at the University of Birmingham and author of this wonderful book that we're here to talk about today. She's published in a number of world-leading journals, including Foreign Policy Analysis, the Journal of Global Security Studies, Democratization, Mediterranean Studies. She's on the POMEP Steering Committee, an all-round good egg, and I'm delighted that she's able to join us today to discuss her wonderful book. Thank you so much, May, for giving us your time today.
Thank you, Simon, for organizing and for the very kind words.
Oh, my pleasure. I mean every single one of them. And I'm also delighted that we have two equally good eggs joining us, all the way from the United States, basking in post-electoral decisions. We have Professors Gregory Gause and Curtis Ryan. Greg is the John H. Lindsay 44 Chair and Departmental Head at the Bush School of Government and Public Service of Texas A&M University. He's the author of myriad, and I mean that literally, books and articles and op-eds pertaining to Saudi Arabia, regional order, the Middle East, the Gulf. You all know him, of course, so I need not say any more. And Curtis Ryan is Professor of Political Science at the Department of Government and Justice Studies at Appalachian State University. Most recently, he's the author of the wonderful book, Jordan and the Arab Uprisings, Regime Survival and Politics Beyond the State, published by Columbia University Press 2 years ago now, Kurt, 2 years. But I'm absolutely delighted that we've got such a wonderful panel of people here today to discuss this incredibly important book. And as always, I'd like to start just by asking the author just a little bit of background context. May, what were you trying to do when you set out to write this wonderful book? What's the idea behind it? Why did you do it?
Thank you, Simon, very much. Well, I think so the book is based on my PhD dissertation, even though now it seems like it's been rewritten over and over, I don't know how many times. But initially as an undergraduate student, but also during my master dissertation, I was always puzzled by how the fact regimes and states in the region were sometimes threatened by non-state actors like Hezbollah or Hamas. Especially during the Lebanese War of 2006, I was particularly intrigued how Egypt, which is a big country with a large military in the region, was often portraying Hezbollah as the ultimate threat to its national security. And that for me was very, very puzzling. And that's how I started looking into threat perception and how states perceive threats, and particularly how regimes in the region perceive threats. And the more I delved in the literature, the more I became even more puzzled, because not many of the questions that we often encounter in IR of the Middle East are answered in the IR literature or in the alliance literature. And I came across, of course, the work of Greg, Gause, and Kurt, and I was even more inspired to build on it and take that, sort of work and try to make it even more enhanced by looking at other cases, more current cases in the region that have not been studied before. Simon, I think you're muted.
Rookie error. It's been a long day. Greg, Kurt, what were your reactions then reading May's book, given that she builds on some of your work on alliances, on threat perception, things like that. Greg, perhaps you can kick us off.
I like the fact that she cited me a lot. That was great. I thought that the most interesting thing about May's book is how she tried to bring together the ideational and the material. And I think that that's always a struggle. If you will, the pure constructivist approach, which maybe in people who've written about the Middle East, you'd see kind of Mike Barnett, but Adib, what's his name? The Iranian guy who's written about Gulf security, May, in Britain. I forget his name.
Adib Mugaddam.
Yeah, Adib Mugaddam. I think he's might be the best example of kind of constructivism all the way down, ideas all the way down. And I've always been, too much of a capital R realist to buy the ideas all the way down. And I think that the outstanding thing about May's book is really trying to struggle with, the scope conditions under which these ideational threats take precedence, and the conditions under which good old-fashioned material power threats are more salient for leaders. And I think that that's the real step forward in the book.
Thanks, Greg. Kurt, do you want to add anything just on your initial reflections?
Yeah, I was really happy to see it because for more than one reason. As all of us who follow Middle East IR these days know, that even 10 years ago or so, we didn't need a big room for all the Middle East IR people on the planet Earth to hang out in. And now there's just been an actual, explosion of fabulous work and really intriguing stuff all over the world of great IR Middle East material. But also it's nice to have somebody come along who's similarly alliance obsessed, because there really aren't that many. So I was really excited about that. And also I thought, in terms of the big picture changes over time in IR theory of the Middle East, even as small of a club as it used to be in the olden times, I agree with Greg. I mean, I think that most of the work had been realist in multiple different levels of realism. And then we kind of got a wave of people working more or less in political economy perspectives and bringing in domestic politics. And I'm thinking of Mike Barnett here, actually, as well as Laurie Brand. And then a kind of wave of constructivism as well. And then Mike Barnett comes back again, but doing this great book on the macro level book on the whole region and constructivism, and people like Mark Lynch looking, within countries from a constructivist perspective. So kind of taking a macro and a micro perspective. But it's really struck me that Middle East IR people, and I think this is a really good thing, tend to be very much about synthesis and sort of theoretically eclectic. And May's work really embraces that. Like a lot of us, I think, have tried to build bridges between perspectives. I mean, Greg was saying he came at it from a realist perspective. I actually originally came at it from an anti-realist perspective. I was working on my dissertation on Arab alliances and so on, that I turned into a book many years later. But I was working with a leading neorealist scholar in alliances, the late Glenn H. Snyder, who was very graciously was cool with the critique of neorealism as the theoretical hook, and hence going in a regime security direction. But what I really like also about May's work then is that it doesn't just build the bridges between these ideational and material interests. It also gets to a question that hasn't really been developed up to this point, except for her work, which is when does one type of influence outweigh the other? And I think that level of detail and precision is the real value added.
Yeah, I completely agree. Before we get into the when, maybe, May, you could just talk to us a little bit about that theoretical eclecticism, the synthesis, the synthesizing, if you will, of the various different positions, the realist, the constructivist, and the broader efforts to answer these complex questions in a sophisticated IR of the Middle East way.
All right, thank you all. I think the very starting point of the book is really connected to an empirical puzzle, which what happened in the region in 1979 after the Iranian Revolution. And it was a time in the region where the Iranian Revolution came to change many things in the region, including how the Iranian regime is trying to export completely different ideas, Islamic sort of ideology, but also a revolutionary one. And at the very same time, Saddam Hussein was coming to power in Iraq, trying to build up Iraq's military capabilities and having very strong ambitions for Iraq in the region. And it was not really about these two, but I think it was about the kind of threats that they were posing to their neighbors. And the outbreak of the war was a crucial moment for many regional actors to pick the sides. So whereas some actors saw Iraq's regional ambitions as the ultimate threat in the region, as something that they have to balance and there is no other option, like Syria did, other countries saw the Islamic Revolution with its message and mainly the ideas coming from the Islamic Revolution as the most pressing source of threat for them. And that's how they sided with Saddam Hussein. And that includes Saudi Arabia and many other Gulf countries at the time. And the question is why some countries perceived or make these decisions based on ideas and others made them based on material calculations. And it doesn't mean that some of them are constantly going to make these decisions based on rational calculations and others are going to make these decisions based on identities. But the region is really full of examples of sometimes actors perceive threats based on ideas and identities, and they become very strongly predominant in their threat perception. And in other cases, it's really the material calculations that come to predominate their thinking when they're facing threats. And the literature did not really provide an answer to the question of when and under which condition we can see this mechanism or the other. Instead, the literature was rather divided over the constructivist and the neo-realist. The neo-realist all along saying, well, it's all about material factors and identities and ideologies are just secondary. They will come always as a justification or as an instrument, but whenever there are sources of threats coming from material factors, they will always predominate. Obviously, the exception to this explanation were huge and constituted a big pattern that Barnett came afterwards and draw a whole book out of all of these exceptions to say, well, it's not really the case, the other mechanism is rather the predominant one, that the identities and the ideas are the driver, and these material structures, they're not objective, they're often subject to the way we see them and the way we make interpretations around them. And in the middle of these two extremes, there was always the eclectic approaches, the work of Gause and Curtis and many others in the region, studying the Middle East, looking at the fact that these two forces and these two factors are always there and we cannot discount them. And for me, the puzzle or the gap that was there is really explaining when this happens. So what are the conditions? And therefore, I looked at the literature and I had to go out a little bit to look for concepts like ontological security and combine it with a material explanation of threats. And mainly I was looking at every threat perception and every decision driven by threat perception as having two spheres. One that's ontological, related to the identity, to the ideas, but also another physical sphere related to the material factors, and trying to look at the conditions when one or the other will become predominant. And the conditions were mainly related to factors like the fluidity of the identity, whether the identity was fluid, whether there was always room for identity to evolve and develop and change around the decisions and the material structures, and whether sometimes these threats are evolving in a regional structure that's clear. In many cases, the decision makers are often faced with a very complex reality. And even though we talk about the balance of power and we talk about who's powerful actor, those who are in the decision making, sometimes they don't see things as clearly because the reality is just so complex. And sometimes the clarity of that structure can have an impact on how they perceive threats. So the conditions that I worked on were basically related to the characteristics of the identity when we look at states and the clarity of how they see the material structure around them. So to give you a very, very brief example, Saudi Arabia, for example, when it was facing the threat from Iran, even though Iran at the time was not particularly a material threat, it was really not a clear structure for Saudi Arabia. At the time, there was Iraq that was rising in military capability, but at the same time, the Arab-Israeli conflict was not very stable because Egypt withdrew from the conflict. So there is the threat of the potential threat of Israel. At the very same time, the Russian invasion of Afghanistan in '79 also posed another source of threat. So the Saudis were completely facing several areas where the structure is changing and it's not necessarily clear who they're going to align with. And that was a debate within the royal family and the decision-making circles at the time. Some of them, they were thinking, okay, now it's time to switch the alliance from the US and maybe open the door with Russia because we want to sort of explore the options. Others, they were like, no, we're just going to reinforce our partnership with the US, and Iran is the enemy, and we have to go through that course. And that created a whole debate. But at the same time, the identity in Saudi Arabia was very rigid. The lack of a national identity provided a huge strain on the Saudi kingdom when they were trying to explain and distinguish themselves from the message coming from the Iranian Revolution, which came with a pan-Islamic identity, a pan-Islamic message that was very similar to what the Saudis are trying to convey in the region. So at that time, Saudi Arabia didn't really have the option to change its identity or adapt its identity because the sources of its identity were simply very limited. Lack of national identity, there is only religion and the loyalty to the royal family. And all of a sudden, this is all questioned and challenged. And at the very same time, a very unclear structure in the region. So in that sense, the material threat was not particularly clear to them, but definitely the threat to the identity was very clear and the options to face it were almost none. So I'm just gonna stop here and wait for other questions.
Thanks, May. It's really fascinating hearing you reflect on this. And I think you've done such a wonderful job, both there and in the book, of articulating some of the broader issues at play pertaining not only to Saudi Arabia, of course, but also threat perception, that ongoing balance between the material and the ideational or the ontological, as you put it. Greg, if I may, I'll come to you just to get some of your broader reflections on that as our resident Saudi expert, addressing some of those decision-making processes and that balancing of the two. I mean, what's your response to this? How do you take what May's saying here?
Well, I think May's right. There's plenty of indirect evidence that there was a big debate in the ruling circles in Saudi Arabia about what to do about these twin crises, the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty and the Iranian Revolution kind of occurring at the same time. Because the Americans, on the one hand, are pushing Saudi Arabia to support Saddam. And Syria and Iraq, which very briefly came together at that time because of the fear of what the departure of Egypt from the confrontation with Israel means, we're pushing the Saudis very hard to join the if you will, the Baghdad consensus against the peace treaty. And then all of a sudden, you know, across the Gulf, you've got the Shah falling, the Shah who had been a close American ally and you know, I wouldn't say a partner with Saudi Arabia, but not a major threat to Saudi Arabia, certainly not an ideational threat to Saudi Arabia, a fellow pro-American monarch. Maybe in a balance of power sense, He wants to dominate the Gulf. He could be somewhat threatening, but you never got the sense the Saudis saw the Shah as a big threat. But now you've got you know, a new regime in Iran, as May said, that was hitting the Saudis right at their, if you will, ontological core, right? That they are the Islamic regime in the region, and Iran is not only presenting an alternative to that, it's openly saying that monarchy is an un-Islamic form of government. So that's a big challenge for the Saudis. Unfortunately, what we can't do is get into the Saudi decision-making process because the place is so opaque. What we do know is that the Crown Prince at the time, Crown Prince Fahd, kind of left the country for a while, which is kind of the classic Saudi thing you do when you've lost a political fight. You kind of say, okay, my side doesn't win, you guys take care of this for a while. And I think Crown Prince Fahd, I think he decamped to Marbella or Morocco or someplace and took an extended vacation. And that presents another problem within the family itself. So you're talking about the political elite in the family actually splitting over this. And I think in many ways, getting that elite cohesion back together became the overriding need for Saudi decision makers. And they kind of did a middle course, right? They said, we're going to break with America on the peace treaty, but we're going to stand with America against the Iranian Revolution. And in that sense, we're going to be with Saddam, but more because he's an opponent of the Iranian Revolution than because he's an opponent of the peace treaty. So you saw the Saudis like walking this kind of narrow road, right? They broke relations with Sadat. They allowed their media to insult Sadat in the classic kind of Arab Cold War way, right? On the other hand, and they also cut off direct government-to-government aid. On the other hand, though, there were hundreds of thousands, maybe over 1 million Egyptians working in the Saudi Arabia and the Gulf region. They weren't sent home, right? That would have been the real kind of serious break that would have really hurt Egypt even more than the cutting off of aid. And the Saudis didn't do that, you know. In 1990, when the next big crisis hit for the Saudis, you know, they sent the Yemenis home real fast. And so that was always an option, and the Saudis didn't do that in the 79 context. But you know, we have to kind of extrapolate and infer how the Saudi decision-making process worked from the outcomes, because we're never going to get a look at how the inside decision-making process worked.
On the subject of those outputs then, Curtis, can you just tell us a little bit then about the complexity of alliance building at this time? Because you've got these serious contradictions at play that May obviously does a good job of teasing out in the book. But I wonder if, given that you are our resident alliance expert, if you can just maybe reflect a little bit on that pertaining to these twin sets of strategic calculations that are going on.
Yeah, let me hit on a couple things, actually, including that historical episode, because I think the nice test of a theoretical perspective is if you can sort of plug in completely different cases, and I mean that in more than one way, different countries, but also different episodes and decision nodes and so on, which is actually one of the reasons I like, by the way, the pairing. That it's not just an IR book, but it's a comparative politics and an IR book of comparative foreign policy, and that the two cases are so completely different. I mean, that actually really helps the whole argument, I think. But I was thinking about, in both May and Greg were talking about that period of 79 and the Iranian Revolution and so on. And I'm in my head, I was plugging in other countries to how they reacted, and thinking of both material and ideational challenges, and the country I know best, of course, is the Kingdom of Jordan, but they were squished between some of these cases at that exact moment, literally geographically. And there was a lot of popular support at the beginning, which sounds almost ludicrous compared to Jordanian opinion in 2020, but there was a lot of popular support to support the Iranian Revolution in domestic politics. And the regime wasn't so wonderfully secure that it can ignore huge amounts of domestic agitation, let's say. But that's another thing we might want to think about in our discussion here is, do these things matter for rich or poor states, big or small states? Does that change the way we think about these factors? But there, actually, the King Hussein made us, I would say, a decision in approximately what appears to be 12 seconds to go behind, surprisingly, of all things, Iraq and Saddam Hussein. And if it's the surprise being, this is a country that not only had up to that point been fiercely anti-monarchy, but that it's also a regime that had overthrown the Hashemite monarchy of Iraq and slaughtered the royal family. So it was not an easy feat ideationally to do the sales job to the Jordanian public that actually, by the way, we are playing a big role, but we're going to the other side, just to make that clear. And like Greg said, there was the quick activation of state, media, and so on behind brother Saddam Hussein and how he was standing up to, all of a sudden it became a narrative about the Arab nation against the Persians, and a little bit less about the Sunnis against the Shia at that particular point. But it was it was read as an ideational threat to the regime, that this was, for Iraq, it had overthrown a monarchy back in 1958. But in this case, it was a country that overthrown a Western-backed monarchy a couple of days ago, so that was seen as much more intense and therefore worth the gamble. And then I would say in this case, the material actually came in second, but it was a huge factor. For a country that's aid dependent and small, it can never actually be completely dismissed. And the material, especially in the economic sense, they weren't fearing material in the sense of traditional security, that Jordan was going to get invaded anytime soon, no matter what it chose. But they were fearing what it would mean economically. And they did, to some extent, follow Saudi Arabia's lead. There's a big oil producer and an oil exporter to Jordan. So they wanted to make sure that, and aid exporter to Jordan. But also Saddam Hussein sealed the deal with economic incentives. Basically, we'll give you half your oil supply for free, and the other half that comes from Iraq for 50% the usual price, which is, a fairly attractive deal for an aid-dependent country. But I think it started as ideational and fitting the entire model that May puts forward in her book, and then was followed up with a material attempt to sort of seal the deal, to make it a deal, in fact, and make it last a long time. And then it works in the other direction. I mean, this is a tiny, not particularly influential country, so it's not like it helps Iraq's war effort in Iran, but it was for 8 years the economic lifeline of Iraq, meaning just its access to the Jordanian port of Aqaba during all the sanctions that came down and so on. That port and overland trucking to Iraq was the sort of backdoor lifeline economically for the Iraqi regime, so that Egyptian money and guns were running through Jordan and across Jordan and into Iraq and so on. So I thought I think we very often see a sort of juggling act, and there it depends on how relatively secure or not a regime is. I see it actually as not just a binary, though, I must say. I think of it as, external traditional security threats in the physical sense of, are we fearing invasion or not, is sort of one set of material threats. Are we looking at our economy collapsing or not is a different kind of material threat, but they're both important. But it is amazing how often I think the ideational part seems to cut straight through that and be read by a lot of regimes as almost more immediate and more disturbing. And then the other factors then can kind of tip the scales or seal the deal.
That's really interesting hearing that. And I think I'm inclined to agree about that ideational capacity to cut through. But May, do you want to come back on anything that Kurt and Greg have just raised before we perhaps move on to a different topic?
No, I totally agree with Greg's reading on that particular incident. And I think I talk a little bit about it in the chapter about how this elite, but I think Kurt's story about Jordan is really fascinating. And it also, I mean, at the time when I was selecting the case studies, I exactly did that. I chose two extreme cases because they were just so extreme in the way they perceive threats. And Jordan was another case that I really considered because exactly that, there was always juggling. There was always these two variables that were crucial. And I think I agree on the point that ideational comes first in some cases, but I think there are very few cases where the regimes are unable to do it. And I think they're unable, even though they perceive the ideational and they mobilize the media and they mobilize the resources to manipulate the public opinion and change the position of the public opinion. Most of the time they're successful, but there are also times where they're not really successful in doing that, and they have to revert. The 2006 Lebanon war is an example of this, where they already framed Hezbollah as a threat, but in the end they had to take a step back because the popular support of Hezbollah was just so strong. And I think this is also another aspect that I had hoped to but I don't think I could do everything. But I think this is also a very interesting puzzle, that even though the regimes perceive these threats and then they try to adapt the identity and adapt the narrative to fit their policy choices, sometimes it's not successful, and sometimes the constraints of the public opinion, they come back at that. Egypt and the peace treaty is an extreme example of how Sadat had manipulated the public opinion and even forced the public opinion to agree. But I think this is also another extreme of using violence and coercion to do it. But in general, I think, to what extent or when does the regime accept the fact that they have to let go, or they keep using coercion to change the position of the public opinion, is also a huge puzzle.
Please.
Can I follow up on that? That's what I was trying to say. I like that point. And I also like that in May's work, she explores the differences on the ideational side, really between ideology and identity as not the same thing, right? On the ideological and identity frameworks, they are both ideational, yeah, but that ideology strikes me as more specific, and that's why some of the cases really intrigue me. And what I'm thinking of here is, for example, the cases that are in the book. Syrian-Iraqi relations come up several times, of course, in the book, where you can, I think, conceptualize two countries that at the height of their Ba'athist regimes at various high and low points technically have the same general ideology, but I'm not convinced they have necessarily the same identity in terms of the self-image as which one is really the leader and which one is the splitter and the deviant. And even seeing themselves as frontline states sounds like, okay, now they sound like they're the same identity again, but frontline states against what? You know, is it Israel or Iran? It sort of changes. So I think this is not arguing against it, by the way. I'm saying I'm just sort of teasing out. But the one thing that also really strikes me then is the ideational, therefore, is way harder to get at for me. And it's really important, but it's harder to get at. Whereas Pan-Arabism in particular as an ideological framework, you know, we're very often, I think, used to dismissing it as, well, that's not a causal factor necessarily. And with every crisis, we declare it, you know, meaning internationally, it's dead again, you know, and so on. But one of the reasons I like the way it's explored in the book, because I think it's done in a really sophisticated way, is that it can be, as May points out, activated and deactivated, that states try to activate and deactivate their identity narrative, and then they include these ideological tools, because it seems to me that any alliance choice you make, if you're an Arab country, any alliance choice you make in inter-Arab relations, you can follow up and sell that from a pan-Arabist perspective, because it's still in the Arab framework. You can still use all the language and so on. But as May just pointed out, that doesn't mean the general public buys your argument, but you can certainly try. And it intrigues me to see states make their decisions and then follow them up with a kind of marketing sales job that is much more specifically ideological, not just and try to recreate identity, but then there are domestic struggles over, yes, but was that the correct choice? And is that who we really are? Right?
But that's tough to do if you're siding with Iran. And this is where the Syrian case becomes really interesting, right? The Syrian regime had two real hard sell jobs during recent history, right? One was when they are the major Arab state to side with Iran in the Iran-Iraq War. Really hard to justify that on Ba'athist grounds. And so the Assad regime basically does it as, this is the way to really confront Israel. How many people bought that? We'll never know, right? The other one was when Syria decided to join what we in America called the International Coalition in 1990 and 91 to expel Saddam Hussein from Kuwait. And there we do have some indirect evidence that there were serious issues within the regime, or at least, if not within the regime, within the Ba'ath Party of Syria, because we do have some evidence that that Abdel-Halim Khadem, the foreign minister, kind of had to go out and sell to Baathists in Syria how this was actually a very consistent policy of pan-Arabism. And, one wonders how many people bought it there. And so the selling job in Syria, I think, was probably harder than almost anywhere else.
I want to ask a question about that selling job, but before I do, if I can just ask others who are listening to this, if you have any questions, do please put them in the Q&A and then we'll get to them shortly. Kurt, were you about to jump in?
I was actually just going to add on to that more, since we're talking about sort of historical cases and contemporary ones. May also makes a point of talking about the need to bring in non-state actors in the way we think about alliances, which I think is a fabulous point. And Basil Saluk has written on that as well very recently in some of the POMEP's materials and things like that, that are, our theories are very state-centric, of course, right? So to bring them in. But I was actually thinking about that. I reread May's book in the last couple of days. I was going back through it again. And we kept thinking about Hezbollah now, really, really 2011 and after. And their decision, and Greg, you just prompted me to think about it again, of talking about difficult sales jobs. It's sticking with the original alliance with Syria, so that's not brand new, but sending people there and then over the long, grueling war that's been going on, it seems to me they have a harder and harder and harder sales job to make about whether or not this is in either our material or ontological security interests. And I'm wondering, May, did you have, what do you think about that? Because I think that was one of the cases you were really interested in. I'm curious how that fits into your framework, because I think it does. But.
Well, May, can I just tag on a question? Because I think this segues nicely into a question I was going to ask, which is, when do sales jobs work and when don't they?
Yeah, I think the case of Hezbollah is particularly fascinating, and I worked on this particular case of Hezbollah's intervention in Syria with a colleague of mine, Tamiras Fakhouri, and we published this article it wasn't a special issue edited by Simon, actually, and it was mainly talking about the securitization and the framing of threats and how Hezbollah exactly did that by securitizing its existence around the intervention in Syria, around sending those fighters to Syria, but also about framing the threat and connecting the threat coming from Israel with the threat that the jihadist ISIS was posing to the Syrian regime. And I think at that point, definitely most of the people did not buy it. But with the rise of violence coming from ISIS, with the extremism that happened on the other side of the opposition in Syria, all of this helped as well for people to actually see, well, Hezbollah actually did have a point. So in a way, I think it's not just about the narrative, it's also about what's happening around the narrative. And I think in that particular case for Hezbollah, it was very clear that also the misfortunes on the other side also contributed for people to sort of buy what Hezbollah was saying in the end. But definitely it is a huge problem. And I think it's for me, it was really fascinating to see how Hezbollah, that was a non-state actor, that was embracing a pan-Arab narrative in many, many instances when justifying their policies in the region, all of the sudden switching and saying, well, Sunni extremism is the major threat here. And I think that was definitely a case of exactly what, I was really trying to do in the book, of how the material threat coming to Hezbollah's existence that was posed by the potential fall of the Assad regime made Hezbollah to reframe his identity, the narrative around it, and just try to sell it in a completely different package. So I think these mechanisms happen really often, every single day. Sometimes they're very, very contradictory and very flagrant, like the case of Hezbollah or the case of Syria allying or having a pan-Arab identity, but at the same time allying with a non-Arab against an Arab regime, which is Iraq. And they're completely puzzling because they simply go against the very core of the identity. But in other cases, the framing and the reframing happens all the time. And we just have to try and pick where these happening. But eventually, there needs to be some level of flexibility in the identity for this to happen. And some creativity coming from the actor of how they frame and reframe this. Because Saudi Arabia also tried to do that, but it wasn't successful. They tried to frame it in the sectarian narrative in the 1979. It was not particularly successful at the time, but they also did not really have many other options. How do you justify you being a pan-Islamic regime going against another Islamic regime, also claiming to be a pan-Islamist? It was simply very, very challenging. Greg, you wanna?
Yeah, I think we have to recall that realists would just say all of this is eyewash and it doesn't make any difference, right? But I think that what May's book does is show that this is not just eyewash. It is part of the decision-making process of how these actors decide which side they're going to be on when they have to choose. And you know, it's easy to dismiss some of these, you know, about faces on the propaganda side as saying, well, you know, this is all superficial, this is all epiphenomenal, and the real thing is, you know, power. But I do think that it's more than that. I think May's work shows that, because we can kind of get into, oh, how interesting it is that they, you know, Hezbollah changes its tune on this and the Saudis changes its tune on that. But I think that might leave the impression that it's easy for them to do that. And I think this isn't just, okay, we've made our decision, how do we sell it? Like calling it an ad agency, right? I think these are part of the decision-making process, and that's the difference, I think, in the kind of work that May's done, as opposed to, if you will, a straight realist interpretation of this. And we shouldn't discount the straight realist interpretation of Middle East alliance patterns. I mean, it's been, I think, an interesting approach. Whether I mean, I think you can go back to Malcolm Kerr and the Arab Cold War, and even though I learned a lot about ideology by reading the Arab Cold War, I think Malcolm Kerr gave a relatively straight realist. Not that he was self-consciously IR theoretical, but it's pretty straight realist account of Arab decision-making in the Arab Cold War. And a number of our colleagues, like Fred Lawson, I think, although Fred is I think would not apply the realist label to himself, a lot of his critique of the kind of work that I do and Kurt and May comes from kind of a realist fundament, right? That you guys are just, you're ignoring power, and these ideas are a lot more epiphenomenal. So it's a good debate, and we should welcome the debate. You know, not everything has to be synthesized.
Thank you, Greg. I think you make a better job than me defending. But I think you're totally right on that. Maybe I wasn't, but I think it's also in the book, the fact that I deal, like the way the realists deal with the threat perception. For them, it's just an incident, and then states move afterwards to make the decision. And rather, the way I deal with it, it's a process. So the whole, I mean, the part of threat perception, it's not really just a very short period. It's a long period of time where all of the identity changes happen, all of these calculations happen. So it's part of a process that comes before the decision. And then once the decision happens, there's also another mechanism that comes afterwards.
Yeah. Mate, I want to press you a little bit more on those broader conditions that allow certain sales pitches to find traction and others not, if I may. And maybe we can do this with a reflection on 2006, because I think this is a fascinating one, really interesting time, obviously. So just talk to us, if you will, about the processes going on in the run-up to the 2006 summer war, and the sort of the shifts that are going on in regional politics at this point. Why is it that the Saudis took the decisions that they did, even though it risked doing so much damage to them in terms of their own identity, going against an Arab cause, if you will? Just talk us through some of those things, please.
Yeah, I think the 2006 was definitely, let's say it's a case that I chose because it was a very obvious one that Hezbollah is a non-state actor that's only interested in what's happening in Lebanon, at least at the time. I mean, after 2013, things changed a little bit, but at least at the time, it was only limited to the confines of Lebanese politics. It had no agenda of interfering in any other countries. It has no territorial borders with Saudi Arabia, with Egypt. And nevertheless, the fact that Saudi Arabia considers Hezbollah as a threat was puzzling. I mean, in the end, what could Hezbollah do to Saudi Arabia, really? And that was really the question. And I think in that perspective, definitely the narrative that Hezbollah presented in 2006 was not about sectarian politics. It was rather a pan-Islamist and a pan-Arab regime talk, or a narrative talking about, you know, we are a resistance movement. We are fighting this injustice. We're fighting Israel. And that was just as simple as that. And it was a very simple message that resonated across the region. And Saudi Arabia, all of a sudden, they realized, okay, this is, again, an Islamic movement that still telling the region, telling people across the region that, you know, Islam could be the solution. But nevertheless, we're also Islamists. So where do we fit in that? We're not doing that. Where do we fit in this? And from that perspective, the Saudi, let's say, view of Hezbollah was not really as a threat that's coming from a non-state actor that's going to cause instability or anything, but it's rather the idea of Hezbollah. And it's not surprising to find that Saudi Arabia has been consistently perceiving other political Islam movements across the region as threats. The very same happened with the Muslim Brothers when they came to power to Egypt in 2013. Other Muslim Brother movement across the region have been also identified by Saudi Arabia as a threat. And it's becoming very clear that the problem of Saudi Arabia is not really about the movement, and it's not really about what they're doing. It's rather about their Islamic nature that fundamentally challenges the fact that Saudi Arabia is claiming this as its core identity. And therefore, this fluidity of the identity was not there because there is no other source for Saudi Arabia to rely on. And somehow they had to distinguish themselves. And that's why I used ontological security, because it really shows that it's not just about the identity. There's so much about identity that we don't know. There's the coherence of the identity. There's the flexibility of the identity. There's the consistency, the dissonance, the risk of dissonance, like the fact that Syria had been like a pan-Arab and a secular, but also supporting a political Islam movement like Hamas or Hezbollah, and they're oppressing it at home. So this dissonance is also a factor. So it's not just looking about what the identity is saying, but it's also looking at these characteristics of identity and how they play out in these different cases.
Kurt, do you want to elaborate on any of that, or share some general thoughts about how these types of alliances work beyond the cases that May is talking about?
Well, just in general, I mean, I really do think, I mean, my work originally worked, I would say, was based much more on material, but in two very different ways. Well, three different ways: external security threats, political economy, and domestic political pressures. So I was trying to actually, like May, I had to go fishing somewhere else to find frameworks to sort of make this work. And I ended up looking in comparative politics to try to get inside and then look at how countries, but like Greg, I mean, I started out quite critically looking at these things, I will say, but in the course of doing it, and I think throughout writing on these things for the last few years, I really became convinced that it's not that there were perspectives I wanted to chuck out, like structural realism or so on. I just wasn't satisfied with it, but I thought they were onto something, and I wasn't dismissing any of it. I just didn't think it was a complete answer, and I needed more, right? So I think one of the reasons I like this interactive approach to how alliances work is it's without throwing out the insights of the original ideas of what external security threats and balance of power concerns and balance of threat concerns mean to regimes, because I think they do consider all these things. And I do think a regime security nexus allows you to be at sort of the at that point, that node between internal and external politics, and between military traditional security concerns and maybe newer material concerns, and also economic, concerns. And I think it allows for room to bring in, we've had such great work on ideational influences over the last many years, including May's great work now as well. But I think that spot allows you to keep pulling in these different influences. It does make it more complicated, though. As Greg was suggesting, the sorting process of causality becomes really, really difficult. And there too, I think smaller countries that also, as part of their identity, perceive themselves as smaller, weaker, poorer, more vulnerable, have even more of a bizarre juggling act going on. So all the more reason to be looking at states that ideologically and ideationally see themselves as so different in the region, not just at present, but in the past, between Syria and Saudi Arabia. And I realize this wasn't the exact question, Simon, but I'm going to add this other layer onto it. One of the other things I liked was the case study selection of countries, because we have such great work on some of the giant influential countries of Middle East politics, without dissing any of the work on them. But we have so much great stuff on Iran and Turkey and Israel and Egypt, but not, and great stuff on Saudi Arabia, Greg, as well as May, but not enough on Syria, especially. There's really just not enough great scholarship on Syria. So I love that that was one of the cases. And if I could dovetail my answer back into a question, I was also curious, May, when you selected not your country cases, but your episode cases, because they're clear crisis cases. I mean, they're wars. But in focusing on decision nodes, in terms of sort of testing out alliance theories, did you have trouble narrowing it down to 3 conflicts, or were you also looking at non-conflict, non-war moments as still decision modes, nodes where alliances shifted, but it wasn't actually a crisis or war? Would that give us a different set of answers, or why? Because you have to boil it down to something, but why did you pick those 3, and how did that kind of work out?
Yeah, thank you, Kurt. I always love the question about how I made the selection. I think Francesco as well had a question in the comments that also talked about what other cases where the framework would not apply. I think I had to make 2 choices: the country cases, and along with Saudi Arabia and Syria, I had the cases of Jordan and the cases of Egypt as well. So I was considering these 4 cases. And to be honest, Egypt was too easy, in the sense it was just a prototype of going through the material, and it was very easy for the identity to be reframed because there were so many layers of identity and multiplicity of identity. So it was just a very, very obvious case in that sense. And Jordan was, for me, really, really fascinating. But I thought also the fact that Jordan was a small state brought another layer, the one exactly that you talked about, that many of the alliance decisions were driven by interests and rather profits instead of threats. And that's why it did not really fit what I wanted to do, as a threat being the main driver of the alliance. So in that sense, Jordan fit in some cases, but not really in many cases. And it was not consistently about threat perception. It was also many episodes about balance for profit. So I think that was one of the main reasons I excluded Jordan. When I looked at the episodes, I needed cases where there were two extreme sources of threats, ideational and material. And wars really provided that. It was very clear during these wars that the threats are to the maximum, it's the peak. And I just needed that to show, even at the peak of where the material threat could be there, ideational threats might be driving threat perceptions, even at the time where material threats are very, very obvious. So I was going for the extreme cases to show these divergences between Syria and Saudi Arabia. And I chose the three regional wars because, the Iran-Iraq war was a very, very flagrant example. And it was my main driver. And it was really the puzzle that made me think about the whole question, but also the literature. The case of Hezbollah was also an obvious case because it was a non-state actor. And then the case of Hamas, even though it was very similar to the mechanism that were seen in the case of Hezbollah, it was very important to add another non-state actor, which is Sunni, to show that Saudi Arabia was rather threatened by the Islamic nature rather than by the sectarian nature, to sort of defend the sectarian argument. The case that I also hesitated the war was the 1990 and 1991 episode. And that was for me, let's say it was an episode, it didn't really create a problem, but it was the only episode where Saudi Arabia was under extreme amount of material threat, but it was also the case where Syria shifted in its alliance. So on the one hand, it didn't fit what I wanted to do, but I was about to include it to show even under extreme cases, still the argument can hold. But the only problem is that I believe that the Syrian decision to ally with the US at the time, again, was for profit rather than for threat. So it was driven by the profit, by the fact that they wanted to get those debts and these economic benefits, exactly like Egypt did in 1991. And in a way that just did not fit the threat perception as the driver for the alliance, which is what I'm studying. So it's an alliance phenomenon, but it's not really the same. As for the question on the framework where the cases wouldn't have fit, I think the case where I wanted really to explore, but I didn't really have enough knowledge of the case to explore was the case of Turkey, because we have both. We also have Turkey going through several episodes where identity was really important and it was threatened, and there were many decisions that were taken driven by identity and some other driven by power calculations. And I don't know if someone would be willing to take this on, some Turkey expert. I would definitely be interested to see whether the argument will hold or not.
Thanks, May. I thought that point about the possible benefits was really interesting, because it strikes me that there's obviously a reactive dimension to what's going on here, given the threats and the responsive. But I wonder to what extent there's a proactive dimension to this. Greg and I have exchanged a few emails about a quest for order. And order strikes me as being proactive, but it also can involve alliance building and the cultivation of relationships and particular types of actions that may well meet and fulfill some of the criteria that you're setting out, albeit in a different type of way. And Greg, were you about to say something as well?
No, I think going down this order path is probably a good way to go.
Sure.
So I don't know if Greg, you wanna start with this? It seems like you've had a conversation going, so maybe you wanna.
Well, Simon is probably the one who should start because he's thought more about it. I mean, I've written a little bit about hegemony recently, and I think hegemony is something that actors strive for, but very, very, very rarely achieve in its strictest sense. But Simon says there's, if I read him correctly, there's an organizing ability below kind of that absolute level of hegemony where you both have absolute material dominance and your ideas are basically accepted by the broad scope of the actors involved in the system. And it's order, kind of order. There can be competing orders. It can't be competing hegemonies, right? That's oxymoronic. But there can be competing orders, and to some extent, we see these different orders today. I think more clearly than perhaps we've seen them in the past in the Middle East, right? We have an Iranian notion of regional order that is populist Islamist, not necessarily Shia, but that helps, and definitely without American influence in the region, right? You've got a Turkish, if you will, Muslim Brotherhood notion of order, which is also more kind of populist bottom up, not necessarily democratic. We know where Erdogan's going at home, right? But we have an order there that's kind of populist Sunni Islamist that looks more to Turkey for leadership. We have a Saudi order, if you will, Saudi UAE order, which is not bottom-up Islam, but top-down Sunni Islam, right? Everybody fall in line behind the Islam that your government says is Islam. And that brings together official Wahhabism, Abdel Fattah Sisi's notion of where Islam fits into Egypt, and these increasingly kind of do you want to say secular UAE notions? I mean, when they do away with so much of Sharia in personal status law just in the last week, these three countries are united in a notion that the top guy decides what Islam means, right? And then, you've got the fourth player, which is the Salafi jihadist movements that have a very, very different notion. Obviously, the top-down Sunni Islamists are perfectly happy to have America play a very important role in the region. These kinds of, this competition among these orders, I think, is where we're going, because so many all right, and just one more thing and then I'll shut up, because we've got questions and we all have to get back to work, and it's going to be cocktail hour in Britain soon. And so I think that the fact that so many of the states in the Arab world, their direction is up for grabs because they're suffering from civil wars and state weakness, the hangover of the American invasion and then the Arab uprisings, right? Look at all these civil wars. Look at all these places where the nature of the state is contested. And these orders, these countries that want to promote these certain orders have a real interest in how these states go, right? And it's balance of power. Sure, the Iranians, the Saudis, the Israelis, the Turks, they're all playing balance of power politics, but how are they playing it? They aren't playing it with armies so much. They're playing it with trying to affect how the domestic politics in these fractured Arab countries develops. So these countries can join their notion of order in the region. If that makes any sense.
May, do you want to add something on that just quickly, and then we can go over to some questions before we wrap up, as you say, Greg, for cocktail hour or mocktail hour.
It's really lockdown here, so nobody's gonna be up for anything.
That's a very good point.
Hey, we can all drink at home,
Yeah, good point. Well, yes, I totally agree with what Greg and his reading of the region. And I think, yes, definitely this order it's a challenge because the region system now is deeply multipolar. And I think the problem at the moment is that there is no actor that could definitely claim that they have even a little bit more power than the other ones. So if there was even like this small difference, a clear, visible difference, I think things would have been a little bit simple, but it's definitely more complex because they have a different idea of what they want the region to look like, but they also do not have the power to force it or make others do what they want. And that's the situation we are in. And I'll leave it there.
Thanks, May. Kurt?
I think that was a really interesting point, both those points actually, because I agree completely that I think we have a very, very, very multipolar system, almost chaotic multipolar system. I love the idea of thinking of it as competing regional orders on the menu at the moment. But therefore, what interests me is not just the major powers and their self-perception as they're trying to project their major their Sunni populist order, as Greg put it, with from the Brotherhood to Turkey, or the Saudi Emirati version, or even the Iranian-led version, but also the states that see themselves in the context of this as increasingly, no one will see them as the leaders of any order, even if they might once have been in the past, like Egypt, but not at the moment. But therefore, the ones that see themselves as peripheralized and marginalized in these competing orders and noticeably left out, or included, but clearly as vassal states in somebody's program. So it's been really interesting to me to see in the last couple of months, countries migrating towards each other who don't have any particular ability to influence any of these outcomes, but are banding together in a sort of light version of alliances, like Egypt and Iraq and Jordan. And I'm a little surprised Morocco and Tunisia have not yet come along for the ride. But as to just remind the other ones that they actually even exist, even if, and oddly enough, it's been most striking that states are coming together who appear to have completely different incentives. You know, we're coming together because it's really about Iran. We're coming together because I really want to intervene in the war in Libya or something. But we're coming together was the key part there. And we're sort of pulling our efforts. We're going to go through all the motions and see where that actually takes us. And that I think is just kind of fascinating to watch the movement of the marginalized to try to get mobilized and see what they can do with it in a sort of haphazard sort of way, and see where that actually takes us.
Movement of the marginalized. I like it. Okay, let's go into some questions. I'm conscious of time. We've gone well over already, so I'm going to just pick 3 short questions, and then if we can move through those swiftly, then everyone can get back to work or whatever else anyone has to do. So the first question, was Syria's decision to oppose Iraq in the war against Iran based on material, balance of power considerations, or ideology and ideational ailment? So that's one I'll throw out there. The second one, could the ideational material analysis be applied to other quote unquote new threats, such as China's rise in the region? And then the final one, what do you think mattered more in Hezbollah's decision to intervene in Syria? Were they material factors or ideational ones? And is it the same for Hezbollah's intervention in Iraq? So if I go around the 3 of you, and then perhaps we can just take a few quick thoughts and observations. As in how you see fit. And obviously we'll start with you, May.
All right, so I was thinking maybe to share the questions with Greg and Curtis so we don't have to answer all, or I don't know, Simon, what would you prefer?
You pick and choose anything that you want to take out of those questions. They were addressed to you as this is your party. And then maybe Kurt and Greg can add any cherries on top that they see fit.
So yeah, so the question on Hezbollah and its intervention in Iran, I think, yes, definitely it was a case driven by Hezbollah's sense of threat to its existence. Simply the fall of the Assad regime would have meant cutting the line life to Hezbollah. And this was just an existential threat. And it was a decision based on this particular calculation. And in the end, the reframing and the whole identity change that came in the process of making that decision was not the driver, but rather as part of the process of that decision. But definitely it was a very clear cut of material threats really taking precedence here. And I think there was the last question, why Hezbollah, the Brotherhood, and similar groups perceived as an ideological threat by Saudi Arabia if they're pro-Islam. I think this is I think I wrote like the whole Saudi chapters really trying to explain these, and I have a very, let's say, a very compact article in Foreign Policy Analysis that mainly talks about this point, but very briefly, it's the identity similarity that in many cases may pose the threat, that it's not just about having an ally that shares with you the same identity. A certain level of similarity might be acceptable, but a high level of similarity can pose a threat, because in the end, every individual, every state, every actor have a need for a distinctive identity that makes them distinct and particular compared to others in their community. And having that similarity is just threatening, and they have to find a way to find the difference and distinctiveness. And that's why Saudi Arabia have been mainly opposing and feeling threatened by other Islamist movements in the region, because they're simply too similar. And finally, the question on Syria's decision to oppose Iraq in the war against Iran was based on material. Yes, it was based on material calculations, and that's how it was very, very problematic for the Syrian identity at the time. And Syria had to go through a whole process of identity reframing, that allying with a non-Arab, as long as they fight Israel, it's still acceptable and it still can be defined within the parameters of pan-Arabism. So this is very briefly.
Thanks, May. Good.
I just wanted to follow up on that exact one. I agree with that. I just wanted to add something else to it. And that is, I think with the Syrian decision at the time, there was also a whole domestic politics background, I think, to that set of decisions. And that is before the Iranian Revolution and eventually the Iraqi invasion of southwestern Iran and the kickoff to the Iran-Iraq War, and then Syria has, a big decision to make suddenly. There was a temporary attempt at a union, one of these many failed pan-Arab union attempts between Syria and Iraq. And Eberhard Kienle has a great book, where he looks at the Ba'ath versus Ba'ath, dynamics and so on. But I think it's worth then thinking about the domestic political pressures that Iraq had used, how Saddam Hussein had particularly, in a sense, used Syria to ascend to power, and then blamed all his opponents as being Syrian tools who were part of a coup attempt against him, and used it basically an anti-Syrian purge to solidify power in that period, which obviously went noticed in Damascus. I mean, they were blamed for the whole collapse. At that particular point, I would say state media was in an absolutely shrill mode of anti-Iraqi, deviation from Baathism as just a heretical version that was emanating from Baghdad, and they were traitorous betrayers. And then they invaded Iraq, so they had a whole other domestic dimension of going into this. I agree that beyond that, the sales job, if we were calling it that, so in our discussion here, was incredibly difficult to how to explain you're supposedly the center of gravity of the pan-Arabist movement and the beating heartbeat of pan-Arabism, and now you have to explain why you're going after Saddam Hussein in Iraq and backing the Islamic revolutionary regime in Iran. Now that was tough to do, but I think they felt like they had so many almost Machiavellian level of decisions to go against Iraq. They didn't have a shortage of reasons. They just had a really difficult explaining job to do about why this was suddenly an okay thing, which sounds, that's some hardcore power politics and ideational politics at the exact same time, right? Because it was about an ideological and power struggle.
There's a reason that Lisa Wedeen talked about acting as if in Syrian politics, right? You had to act as if you were a good Arab nationalist. I just want to go real quick.
Please.
I think Syria's role in the Iran-Iraq war is best seen through the regime security lens that May suggested and Kurt expanded on. And I don't think that we should underestimate the threat that inter-Ba'athist manipulation might have been seen to pose to the Assad regime in Syria at that time, at a time when Saddam Hussein appeared and Iraq appeared at the height of the oil revolution, with Egypt leaving the Arab fold, as it were, signing the peace treaty with Israel. Standing against Saddam Hussein might have been very difficult, and seeing him as a threat to your regime, I think, after the breakup of the Union was, as Kurt said, that helped. That to me explains why Syria did what it did in 1980. You know, this idea that similarity is can be a threat, ideological similarity, is something Steve Walt talked about in Origins of Alliances, right? And his example, of course, even though he was talking about the Middle East, was the Soviet Sino-Soviet split in the communist world. But he also saw the Ba'athist split as being explained by this idea that if you're so close, you can be a challenge to each other ideologically, although he would never use that term because he's a good realist, right? And I think that Origins of Alliances is one of these books written by a realist that when you get into the weeds, you have to bring in other things, right? And for Walt, of course, it was threat versus power. But breaking down what threat is to some extent what May's book does, to some extent what both my work and Kurt Ryan's work has done, and a lot of other people who've talked about Middle East IR. Hezbollah and Syria, to me, the Hizb going to help out the Assad regime is a perfect example of an overdetermined result. Both the material and the ideational move them in that direction. Yes, it goes against the whole idea that all the Hizb ever was a Lebanese national party. But everybody knew that that was not true. The real ideational, ontological element of the Hizb, right, is their acceptance of the Iranian order, if you will, their acceptance of the Iranian definition of what legitimate politics in the region is. And when the Iranians were in trouble, right, within their ally of Syria, there's a material interest, the supply lines and all that stuff, but there's also this kind of ideational, the Iranian order is at stake if Syria falls, right? And so I think that in many ways his decision to go into Syria is overdetermined and actually relatively easy to explain. Finally, China. I think this is so interesting because during the Cold War, if you're a Middle Eastern state and you side with either the Americans or the Soviets, there's a domestic element to what you're doing, right? If you're siding with the Soviets, you're supposed to treat your communists a little nicer than perhaps you did before. You don't always do it. Abdel Nasser didn't treat his communists nicely, but you're supposed to treat your communists nicely. If you sign on with the Americans, you're supposed to treat your oil companies nicely, and you're supposed to treat the Israelis nicely because the Americans, want you to do that, and that's really problematic. The Chinese are coming in with none of this baggage. They're coming in with none of this baggage. It's not like Mao coming in to support the Dhofar Rebellion in 1968, right? Where you had to, wave the little red book and all that. The Chinese they don't care what you do domestically, and they don't care what you do vis-a-vis the Israelis. They just want to buy stuff and sell stuff, at least so far. And so I think there's all sorts of, I think the Iranians look to China, and in a strange way, the Saudis look to China too, as an alternative great power who will help them out from a security perspective at some point, but by the same token, doesn't put the same demands that these stupid Americans do on you all the time. Behave yourself, be nice to the Israelis, stop killing your dissidents, and some of that is eyewash from the United States, but it's still, you got to deal with it. And here the Chinese are coming and they're not giving you any of these problems. And so there's this notion that China is going to be the outside power that's going to help us. We'll see how far that goes.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, everybody. This has been absolutely fantastic. I've learned a great deal, as I always do at these events. There's a lot for me to digest and think about. But all that remains for me to do now is to say a number of thank yous. Thank you to Elias Ghazel for all of his efforts putting this together. Thank you to all of the attendees who've made it through to the bitter end. Thank you to Greg and Curtis for your time. And last, but by certainly no means least, thank you, May Darwich, for writing a wonderful book and for giving up your time to talk with us today. It's been wonderful, and I'm really pleased that we've been able to pull this together. So thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure. Take care, everyone.